All right, this will be the third and the last lecture for Chapter 1. Then move on to Chapter 2. Look at this one, we're having this natural capital, which we looked on in the last lecture, in the degradation. And these are some of the factors that go into how that gets degraded. And these are all symptoms of how that works, or factors that cause it. And you can kind of see this is having a larger population, more people using it, it's going to get used up more quickly, and down the list. I won't go into each and every one of these. Poverty sometimes is blamed, and this is, of course, using that, and absolutely that is true. Poverty is a factor that people are more concerned about just sustaining themselves, and they will abuse resources. But this can also just as easily be done by people with means, people like us. And that is called a vocab word called affluenza, people that use resources in an unsustainable way per capita, in comparison to poverty, where you have people that just aren't concerned because, again, they're just trying to get by. Okay, so looking at this one, environment or poverty, environmental problems, and you can see that he gets given some numbers here and some percentages of the amount of people in the world that lack access to a variety of things: sanitation, fuel, electricity, drinking water. It's kind of disturbing the amount of people you see on here that are actually lacking some things that we just call like basic goods. And you can kind of see here an individual clearly is lacking food and just general resources. Okay, we'll do an activity like this a little bit later in the year, but we're going to introduce it right here. This one, sometimes they call it the IPAT, so they'll put the impact over on the left-hand side. But typically you're looking at 3 factors that will go into the idea of environmental impacts of a particular population. So it's different depending on what part of the world you're talking about. We have an impact being a very developed country, and developing countries have a somewhat different impact. And one's not necessarily better than the other. And you can kind of see with those arrows on there, you can see the impact relative to the third column over there, the technological impacts. We actually almost balance out in regards to that part. But because, again, we're affluent, we have these huge structures that we like to have, homes, in comparison to less developing countries that, this here is very primitive and its impact is comparatively low. But you can see that based upon where you are, different countries and per capita are going to have different impacts on the environment. Okay. Cultural changes, these are things that have affected a lot of things, just simply our way of life, and then also in how we interact with the world around us, the environment. Agricultural revolution allowed our populations to explode. Actually, all of these things did, and they just keep building upon each other. So the industrial medical revolution has really carried us up to probably maybe the late 80s, early 90s. And now with this information globalization revolution, it's continuing to go along there, just having more and more resources available. So this really is something that's happened well within my life, and really kind of in the beginning, just before you guys came around. Okay, so these are some of the trade-offs that you have because of these wonderful things that have happened, but there's downsides to them as well. And you can kind of read through these. I won't go through them all, but looking at these advantages in comparison to disadvantages. So looking at the very first one on there, the higher standard of living for many, and then looking at the potential problems that kind of go along with it. They're not like, smack right next to each other, but you can see that these things all do kind of go along with each other. Looking at this one in regards to a worldview. And this is expressed differently depending what resource you're looking at. I happen to like this one, so I'm putting it in there. Having this planetary management, this is the least well thought out, that we are the managers, humans, and we are separate, and these things that we're doing to the environment don't affect us. We're just kind of taking what we want, and that's the way it goes. Stewards are somewhere in this middle ground area where we're still using stuff for our own needs, but we should use them in a way that is least damaging as possible. And then, of course, on the far right-hand side is the most well thought out, that, look, we're in this world, so it's kind of like, well, I won't give you any funny analogies. I have to control myself with that sometimes. Everything that we do to this environment will eventually come back to us. Maybe not us individually, but possibly the next generation. So we have to use things in a responsible way, understanding that we are a part of it. You saw this probably early in your notes, like, how does nature obtain sustainability? Well, here you go. You have these 4 things kind of working together. And this is a thought process, a mindset that you should have when any of these topics come up, a new technology or an idea. Does it rely on solar energy? Ultimately, this is sustainable. This is how the world does it. These are the questions. How does nature normally do this? Biodiversity. The more biodiversity, the better. So, for example, our crops. If you look at across the middle of the country, it used to be a prairie with thousands of different species throughout. Now we typically like monocultures, which is like corn or wheat, just one thing. It's easier to process. Nature doesn't like that. Population control. Naturally, populations are kept in check. So as I showed you in that graph in the very beginning, lecture 1, we're not in check anymore. Nothing is keeping our populations down. And typically we develop things like vaccines that help us live a lot longer. We can evade some of these things that make us sick and die. And then nutrient cycling. There's only so many nutrients to go around, and this helps control populations and everything else. We have developed ways of making our own nutrients, think ammonia. And this has allowed us to kind of cheat the system, being non-sustainable. And this is a little graphic. You can pause it and take a look at it a little more on your own. All right, this is one of these pillars of environmental science. Aldo Leopold. He wrote a book back, I want to say in the 20s or 30s. I can't remember exactly when it was. It's called San County Almanac. There's actually kind of 2 parts to it, where he kind of lists out the world around him and how it works. And he did it in a different way, where he was kind of noting growing seasons and when birds would arrive and when they would leave. And then his son or daughter or some relative of his did it again later. And this is one of our first abilities to really see a well-documented climate change event. Because a lot of the things that he was documenting happening back in the 20s or 30s or whatever time period it was, we can see that things are happening earlier, things are showing up, and things are going away later in comparison, really just a reflection of what climate change is. But he was really good in regards to demonstrating and expressing that we are a part of nature, that we're not a part of it. So kind of moving past the idea, he still was considered a conservationist. In other words, that we manage these resources around us, but he was also looking at it from a preservationist viewpoint, that we are a part of this and we need to live within the environment as opposed to being just this caretaker of something other than us. Okay, so these are some of the ideas, again, of principles of sustainability, a better mindset of things, that how nature does it and how we should reflect what we do based upon how nature does it, and then some lessons that we can take a look at as well. So I'm not going to go through all of these. There's a lot of them on here. You can take a look at this on your own. And one more, just kind of repeating this in a different way. How we typically do things on the left-hand side, and how we should maybe rethink this a little bit on the right-hand side, being more sustainable in how we go through things. And then the categories: energy, matter, and life. And that is our last slide for Chapter 1. For this testing period, we have 2 chapters. I think it might be just Chapter 1. So this will be the end of the lectures for Chapter 1.